Relationships, long-term relationships, let's face it, they're hard. They take a lot of work. You've heard it over and over again. Communication is the key to a great relationship. But what does that mean? You see, a few years ago, my wife and I were talking, and despite all the great things about our relationship, we were just simply dysfunctional when it came to solving certain problems together until we learned and started practicing almost daily the system we're going to talk about today.
Welcome to the Evolve Podcast, a podcast about disrupting your life to spark new evolution. Evolve your body, evolve your mind, evolve your soul, and evolve your tribe. And now it's time to disrupt.
Miles, look who we have with us today. Is my beautiful bride of almost 25 years joining us on the podcast today. And I'd love to say that we are in the same room, but unfortunately the sound didn't work and something's off with our system, but she's right next door.
Yeah,
So
whatever. It works.
It works, right? And with that, folks, we want to welcome you to another episode of the Evolve Podcast. Joining me, as always, from Oberlin, Ohio, the most interesting man that I know is W. Miles Riley. Welcome, Miles.
Here we go. I think your intro should have had written in it was the hardest hitting southpaw woman in the whole state of Utah.
Well, we haven't got to hers yet. We're introducing you as her boxing coach.
Okay.
But somewhere in the mountains of Utah, I am Steve Cutler. And tonight we have probably the most important guest we've had on the podcast. And Miles, she was a tough guest to get on. Let's face it. I mean, joining us today is my beautiful bride of almost 25 years, Danielle Cutler. For our listeners who have not met Danielle, Danielle is a mother of 3 smart kids. She's a financial professional, an artist, a creator, a musician, and a former fitness competitor. And she does throw a mean southpaw, as Miles well knows, as her boxing coach.
Yes.
Danielle, thanks for joining us.
And you.
That is true. And since you opened that up,
there is a story there.
We're going to tell that. Can we tell that story?
Yes.
So we got married almost 25 years ago. And, I'd been, like most people in college, you were living with roommates, you had friends, and so we played pranks on each other. Well, Dave and I got married, and I thought it would really be funny to play a prank on her when she got into the shower at one point. And what I didn't know at the time is there are very few things that Danielle hates more than being cold. So here she is in the shower, and I sneak my way into the bathroom. We've got one of those showers where the shower curtain is pulled so she can't see that I'm coming in. And I take a cup of cold water and I pour it on her head, and I get no response, like absolutely no response. You would think that there's going to be a scream or something, right? So after getting no response, I slowly pull the curtain back and I see this almost terrified girl sitting in the corner. And without even thinking about it, that left hook came out and he smacked me right in my eye.
I like it.
He got it.
I was so shocked.
He shocked me. Like, who wants cold water poured on him when they're taking a nice hot shower? And I was like, cold water dumped on my head, so he got popped.
I like it.
I just started laughing. I mean, this is like the antithesis of who Danielle is. She is the kindest person in the world. Everybody that knows her just falls in love with her and knows how kind she is. And so this is the exact opposite of who she is. I just had to laugh. And that actually became a really interesting thing for us where we now use the term cold water. When something is that we do to each other that really bothers us, we look at that and say, hey, that's a cold water. And we know that that's just somewhere that we don't
you went too far. It was a trigger though. Like I wasn't even like, oh, I'm going to punch you in the face. It just happened. Like he opened the thing and it was like a knee jerk reaction. I'm like, punch without thinking.
It was pretty funny. Like it really was funny.
But I understand if you do something wrong, Steve, that she doesn't like, she can say that was cold water. What do
Mm-hmm.
you say?
We just use the same term.
Yeah,
Because the
that's
cold
just
water, that's a
that's
common
it.
language now. So if she does something, I'll say, hey, that's cold water. And we just know not
Okay.
to tread there. It becomes
Well, I'm
something
glad
where
we're
we have to
talking
take a
about
step
language
back.
then, because I'm going to take both of you to task with this because that should not be yours, Steve. Yours is
Okay.
something else. Okay.
Yeah,
I,
okay.
so
Thanks
now
thanks for
we
the
have to find
relationship advice.
Yep.
we have to find Steve's term, and then I need a term for me, even though I'm not in a relationship. I know things that piss me off. I got to figure out what the term would be. Oh, this is
Hey,
already
I like
interesting.
it because then it's
you,
yeah,
you
then
can you
it's
can
you
still the
know where
cold water.
yours is. What is it for you? Yeah, I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So we're,
we try
we're
and just
off and
come up with
running.
a common term. And
Yeah.
cold water is one, but we've got other common terms that we use or common phrases for
Uh-huh.
other situations that we know what we're talking about. You know, some of them I think came from me, some of them came from Danielle, and so we just have adopted them. We look at our relationship as there's you, there's me, and there's we. So there's essentially three parts to this relationship. There's
Yeah.
Danielle's needs, there's my needs, and then there's the needs of the relationship that are important.
Yeah.
And so when
Yeah.
it comes to the need of the relationship, we just thought, hey, that's a pretty common thing that both of us can remember because it was pretty shocking to me. I think it was pretty shocking to Danielle because um, again, it was so reactionary that it's
Yeah, I
just
didn't
that's
think
not
about
how
it.
she is. And so we've laughed about it a lot over the last 25 or so years.
I like that her reaction was violent.
Yeah.
I actually do too.
No, no, I really do. I mean, seriously,
No,
like
I'm serious. Yeah.
you would get you would think a lot of people's reaction would be more about flight, screaming or hollering or running or whatever. But
Right.
you threw a punch. I really like that because that means like your automatic response in a situation that you're losing is not to cower away but to strike out.
Yeah.
Back.
So
Yeah.
I really like your response.
Yeah. That segues right into what we're talking about today of nonviolent communication, where I went violent.
Yeah, that was more of our violent communication. I think there is, like Miles is talking about, there's room for violence in life,
Oh
and
yeah.
a fight. It has to be there. But yeah, you're right. It is a great segue. I mean, what we're going to talk about today, it's we've been talking about putting this on the podcast for several months now. I mean, Miles and I have talked about it in several of our conversations. Obviously, Danielle and I practice this on almost a daily basis. Um, but I'm excited for our guests to really engage with this particular episode because I think that this topic and this methodology that we're going to be discussing today, it's something that's going to have immediate impact on people. And I know that far too often people use that term, right? Far too often when somebody's trying to sell something, they'll say, oh, you're going to see an immediate impact. This truly is a topic and a technique that has immediate impact. When you start to learn how to use this methodology of nonviolent communication, you will see the results in your first communication. So it's got immediate impact, and I'm really excited for our guests, or excuse me, for our listeners to learn about this practice. So, how we doing? Are we ready to get going?
We are ready to get going, but let me just add something and see what you and Danielle think about what I'm about to say. Is if we're going to talk about nonviolent communication, should we spend a few minutes just talking about communication, period?
Yeah, great thought. You
Because
you
because
lead
that can,
out on that one, and then we'll bring
Yeah,
it back to the practice.
you go,
yeah.
Miles. We'll go with you.
Well, because the reason why I brought it up is because I have this idea that I play with all the time that every situation or intrapersonal situation calls for its own form of language. Steve and I have talked about that before. I can't
Yep.
I can't talk to Tiago the way I talk to Steve. Tiago
Hmm.
perceives the world in a certain way. A 14-year-old boy, Steve's a grown man. I can't talk to Steve the way I talk to Alicia. I can't talk to the three of them the way I talk to myself. So it's almost as if you have to become an artist with language because you're crafting language and its nuances to get your message across. So you can't talk to people the same way. You can't talk to the same person the same way in different situations, let alone
Yeah.
talking differently to different people. And I
Yeah.
think as we get older, we get a set of language or vocabulary that we codify and we spread it across the board with no matter who we're talking to, or if we're not aware of how language gets used, we miss that. I notice I don't talk to this person the way I talk to that person, the way I talk to that person. And if you're unaware of it, you can't use it as a tool.
Yeah, and I think you make a really interesting point. When you think about language, far too often when we learn a language, we forget to learn another part of that language, a deeper level to that language. We
Mm,
forget to talk to the person that's sitting across from us and learn their language. What do
right.
they need? How are they interacting with the world? How do they see the world? And what resonates with them? Just like we were talking about earlier, cold water to Danielle meant something, right? That meant this is a no-go zone. And so then we adopted that into our language. Now, if somebody didn't listen to this podcast, they didn't know us, and they didn't know that that was some sort of the lexicon that we use in our relationship, and they heard us use the term cold water, they would probably think we're talking about cold water coming out of the tap or cold water
Right.
that's in the bathtub or whatever it is. They have
Right.
no idea what the definition, but the definition
Or something
is
kinky.
totally different. They might think it's kinky, yeah. Depending on where their mind is,
I
it'll
know,
be like cold, Miles.
Right. But yeah, that's exactly what it is. I agree, Miles, because for me, the cold water, that was my language of like, that was like, why would you do that to me? That's not funny. That was an awful experience. That made that I got no humor out of that. That was shocking. That wasn't funny. And to somebody else, it might be like, that was so funny. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna get you back. I'm gonna like one up you, or whatever, like where I took it
Mhm.
that certain way. So it is all about the like delicacies of who you're dealing with and being able to for your wavelengths to come together where you're not like on these different.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It
And
really is
it's
about
almost,
lining up those wavelengths. Yeah, you're right. I mean,
yeah.
everybody has a different resonance and
Uh-huh.
understanding what those wavelengths are. Now, I would say that 25 years in, we probably would both look at something like that and think it's funny and want to up each other because the relationship has
Yeah.
changed over the
Right. I
years,
was young.
right?
Yeah,
But
it's very different 25 years ago, and I was so young,
yeah,
and it was, yeah, very different. I would definitely like try to one up you or chase you through the house, or something would be different. But back then, that was just like, oh my gosh, why would you do that to me? It was not funny. I don't know.
I would think now it would be a left, a right, and a hook.
Yeah,
it might
yeah.
be.
It was just
Yeah.
one pop. It would be a 1-2 uppercut, cross, bob and
Now you
weave.
taught her how to fight really
Miles
well,
taught me the
Miles.
full
Yeah.
sequence. Well, there would be some kicks in there too, because I'm actually really better. I'm better at my kicks than my punches.
Yeah, the
Well,
kicks are pretty impressive.
let's play with this idea then, because I'm thinking of how intrusive cold water thrown on somebody in the shower
Yeah, that's
could be.
intrusive. Yes.
And I think of, first of all, you're in the
You
shower.
just gave her a new part of the
Yes,
language. It's intrusive.
it was
Intrusive because
intrusive. It
think about
was.
it. You have to close when you get in the shower. Think about the privacy element and not the privacy, well, the part of the privacy, but just a sense of your own aloneness, and you get into your own zone. In order to do that, you have to
Zoned
close
out.
two
Yeah.
doors.
Mm,
You
Yeah.
yeah.
close the bathroom door and you close the shower door. So you really think that you're just insulated and it's just you and yourself
And steam. And it's the
and
steam
steam.
and
And
steam.
again,
Don't forget
it's
the
this,
steam.
you got all these elements of ultimate privacy, and somebody has penetrated both those doors, and one of the doors they didn't penetrate, they went over. That's such a
Yes.
violent, intrusive act.
Ah,
Yes.
yeah. Yeah.
So if we think
Yes.
of these two doors as metaphors of talking to people and understanding the two doors that they have closed, metaphorically speaking,
I love it.
instead of intruding through those two doors, how do we open them gently to receive the message of cold water so they can accept cold water?
Yeah,
Yes.
that's a great question. And that's
I
actually
love
what
it.
this practice that we're going to talk about does. It's a way of identifying how do we not step on another person's thoughts, feelings, and emotions. But
Yeah,
I think part
yeah.
of what's really impactful. See, now we're telling you the shortened version of cold water, right? I told you the funny story. I told you where we're at now. That cold water means something. What I didn't tell you was that it took us probably 2 or 3 years to figure out this idea that cold water needed to be code for us for
Mm,
something that that's a no-go zone. So there was a lot of mistakes along the way. There were a lot of barriers and boundaries that were crossed and stepped over, and emotions that were thrown aside, or emotions that were just not even really understood until we finally
Mhm.
got to the point where we understood. And some of that, I think, when you think about communication, great communication happens when both parties listen to each other well, and both parties are also are able to communicate what their emotions and what their needs are. Now, if there's
Mhm.
a breakdown in either one of those sides of the communication, then the whole situation breaks down. And like I said in the introduction, we found ourselves 20 plus years into this thing we call a relationship and a marriage, and said, wow, we still really suck at certain problem solving resolution type things. We're really dysfunctional. And what
mm,
we found was that, we would have these ways of navigating, we'd have these ways of doing things, and we'd get through it, but neither one of us would feel great about it. Like, let's say
Mhm.
that we were working through a problem or a situation, and uh, it ended up being that maybe Danielle would acquiesce and say, okay, well, let's do this. Well, I didn't feel good because I'm not wanting her to just go with my way. I don't think my way is the best way. And she didn't feel good because she wasn't fully expressing what was inside of her. And so, regardless of what a person's relationship is with their partner, because there's always going to be one that might be a little bit more um, dominant communicator and one that might be a little bit more submissive communicator, this process works on both ends. Because
Mhm.
while there's one that could be aggressive, the other one could be passive aggressive. And the key in that, and Danielle and I've talked about this multiple times over the years, aggressive is still the term that fits into both sides. If somebody is passive aggressive, it doesn't mean that it's a better way to go. And here she is punching. But
That's where
but it
my
essentially
punch
boils
came.
down to
Yeah, who was the aggressive one? Who's the passive aggressive? What do you think?
you were definitely the aggressive one in that time.
Yeah, yeah, always.
Yeah.
I was the
Yeah,
aggressor.
always. Yeah, always. So let's jump into and build off of what we talked about so far. Just jump into where this concept came from. So, um, I can't remember where I got introduced to this book, but Marshall Rosenberg, he wrote a book called Nonviolent Communication. And the way that it was introduced to me is the same way I'm going to introduce it to our leaders, or excuse me, to our listeners. And that is that it's probably the worst name for the best book you'll ever read. Nonviolent communication doesn't really explain what this process is. In a way, it does, because it's a way of taking out enmity. It's a way of taking out the little digs. It's a way of taking out the passive aggressiveness. It's a way of taking out the aggressiveness of the communication. And it's a way of getting two people to the table that sometimes are at odds, either with each other or with an idea. And so in this book that Rosenberg uh, wrote, he details out this process that he used, not just in relationships between husbands and wives, but Rosenberg was a person that would get called if there were literally countries warring with each other and they were at a stalemate and they needed to figure out, okay, you're bombing this person, you're bombing that person. We got to get to the table and figure out a way to not bomb each other. And so that's where this idea of nonviolent communication, how do we communicate so it doesn't lead to this violence? So, there was let me tell you a little bit of our backstory. So a few years back, we were in the midst of a disagreement, and we just really came to the realization that while we had always gotten along pretty well, we love each other, we enjoy spending time together, that we didn't have skills, we didn't have a system, we didn't have a tool that we could use effectively to work through conflict in a simple and elegant way. And one of the things that's always been important to us is that we express love to each other in a way that is important for each other. I receive love different than Danielle does. And so that's always been a big thing for us. And so what was happening is we would build up this goodwill with each other throughout the month or throughout the year. And then we would reach a point where there would be a disagreement or an argument, and it would just go and go and go. And we would literally go into this cycle of at some point we'd look at each other and say, well, what the hell are we really even arguing about? What the hell are we disagreeing about that? And Rosenberg's book opened up this concept to me. And I went to Danielle and I said, hey, I bought you this book too. And I want you to read it. And I want to talk about if you're open to this idea of practicing this so that we get good at it. Now, growing up loving basketball, and Miles, I know you love basketball as well. How many free throws did we shoot back in the day when we were learning to play? And then even when we were playing and we're playing in games, right? The free throw concept was that you go to practice and you shoot the free throw and you do it when nobody else is around. You do it when the game is not on the line, and you get used to doing that same motion over and over and over again. And the idea is that you train your nervous system by doing this practice over and over again. When you get into that heightened state, then if you just go back to your practice, you're able to shoot the free throws, and the pressure of the game-winning shot or just the pressure of the crowd is not going to make you buckle. And so after Danielle read the book and we talked through it and, hey, what do you like about this? What don't you like? Okay, now how can we make it simple? And so we took this free throw concept and we said, what if every single day we just practice? And I would say 9 times out of 10, when we practice, we're not practicing on each other with anything that has to do with each other. So, for instance, we're not talking about some sort of conflict that has come up between us or a disagreement. When we go through the practice every single day, we're literally just practicing on something that's dealing with us. And what the practice does is it fosters good communication within us. Now, we've done this now for, God, how long, Danielle?
I don't know. I was just thinking about that when you were talking. Like, when did we start this? How long has this been? I can't remember.
It's been over a year, maybe 2 years.
Okay, a year.
I don't know, maybe a couple of years.
Yeah.
So what we did is we started every day just practicing and saying, okay, let's run through the practice. And in doing the practice, we saw immediate results. And then when we would go into a more heightened state of communication where tensions were higher, it made the practice, or it made it a lot easier. And I would say more often than not, we would just fall into the practice. Every once in a while, we get into something where we're going back and forth and it turns into more of a bickering at each other. And one of us invariably will look at the other one and say, wait a minute, let's go into our practice. And then we take a deep breath and we go into the practice immediately. Now, here's one caution that I would tell you for our listeners. There's a lot of studies out there that have studied the effectiveness of the importance, I should say, of your emotional state and the way that your nervous system is set up when you go into conflict. And if you go into a conflict situation and you're heightened, if you are angry, if you're frustrated, if you feel like you are emotionally hijacked, and what we mean by that is that you're not thinking clearly, you know you've got some blind spots, and you feel what you're about to say more than you're thinking about what you're going to say, then that's a time to hit the pause button. And what science has shown is that you need a minimum of 25 to 30 minutes to let your system downregulate, and then you go back into a conflict situation. So part of the practice really is twofold. If you practice on a regular basis, now we do it most days of the week, that's going to make a big difference. The second part of the practice is what I just said, that if you're going into a difficult situation, you're trying to resolve a conflict and the emotions are taking over, you need to take a pause, and it needs to be at least 25 to 30 minutes. What we've found, just from our own practice and from reading the science and how the nervous system works, is if we hit pause, one of us, or sometimes both of us, will go for a walk, and we'll go for a walk together and we don't even talk, or one of us will go for a walk, because that's an easy way. You see, we talked about the fight response, Miles, as you mentioned before. So there's fight, there's flight, and then there's freeze. And the flight response can be initiated as soon as you go for a walk. But what happens is your body will understand that it's going into this flight. You're going away from it. But because walking starts to work on that parasympathetic part of the nervous system, it brings the emotions down. And so a 20 to 30-minute walk will bring your emotions down. It will help to reset you. And then you can go back into that difficult conversation. So those are the two keys: practicing it every day. And then when you get into a difficult situation, make sure that your emotional state is ready. All right. So Danielle, for our listeners, do you want to walk them through what our process is and what we do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so now we modified it like ever so slightly, but so now we start, it could be we take like 2 minutes, it could be that we each take like 10 minutes, just kind of depends on the time we have and then what's on our minds. But we start with just saying what we are, what's something positive that's going on right now in our world. What is it, something that is just, that's it, just something that's positive. So it could just really be anything. And so that we're just always starting off on a good tone for the day, and not focusing on negative things. And then our next piece is to say how that to identify how we're feeling. And then again, this could be anything. And then like Steve said, this is not like a conflict situation between us. It's just purely, I'm feeling tired today, or I'm feeling a little anxious about this upcoming thing at work, or I'm feeling really excited about the weekend, or I'm feeling a little bit disconnected, and whatever it is, or it could be a multiple. It could be like 2 or 3, feelings that you've identified. So you just kind of get out, it's just a little gut check. What's inside right now? What's inside of my gut? How am I feeling? What's in there? And then the next thing we identify is, what are my needs? So after all my feelings, what needs are coming based on what those feelings are? What is it comes from that? And then the last thing is the strategy of, okay, so here's my feelings, here's what my needs are, what's my strategy? How am I going to do it? How am I going to tackle this? How am I going to kind of get my feet wet with this problem and try to problem solve it, so I'm meeting my needs and my feelings are being addressed? So it's positives, identify your feelings, needs, and strategy. And then with the whole nonviolent communication thing, the beauty of it is you are 100% owning your own state and how you're feeling. And the biggest thing that this has done for me, and I think our relationship, it's taken away the blame of casting how you're feeling and blaming it on somebody else. That it's 100% you own it. It's mine. The strategy, the needs might be where it comes into the relationship of, this is where we can come together on it. It's 100%, I own it. This is mine.
Yeah, what's
Yeah,
that
great
famous
description.
definition of anger? They said anger is what you do to yourself after the other person has left the room.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Anger and bitterness. Yeah, I think like Danielle said, it really has brought a certain level of emotional accountability for both of us. Um, and going back to what you were talking about earlier, Miles, this is something that has brought a lot more language to our vocabulary. When Danielle's saying
Yeah.
that we go into, okay, here's how I'm feeling, and we don't really delineate between an emotion and a feeling. We know that, like, there might be a sensation. I might be feeling a sensation of an anxious energy. I could call that an emotion, or I could just feel it somewhere in my body, and it's a sensation. And we don't care. We've gotten to the point where we want to recognize the feeling and or the emotion. And this could be anything from, I'm feeling really happy, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling stressed, or as Danielle said earlier, I'm feeling tired. I mean, this last week I've been dealing with this head cold, and so I think every day that we've talked, I've said I feel tired, I feel like shit, I feel like, I mean, there's multiple ways I could describe it, but identifying the feeling or emotion, that's, it's paramount that we do that. And one of the keys that I want to make sure that we point out is, if you haven't picked up on it, what we're not doing is we're not saying you made me feel this way. And we don't do that in our communication when it comes to conflict, because what we realize, and we know, and we live in this space right now, is that how I feel is 100% mine. It's nobody
Mhm.
else's. Somebody cuts me off in traffic, it might spark a feeling in me. But then if I follow that feeling and it turns into an emotion of anger or frustration, well, that's because my focus is there. Now, Danielle may do something, or let's say that when I threw the cold water on her, right? I created the stimulus. Now, her initial response to that is physiological. It's not something
It's
that she
shock.
can't sit there and say, yeah, there was a shock to it, right? We're not going to lie about that and say, no, I don't feel the shock. This is not about emotional blindness. This is about recognizing what the feeling is. But she feels that emotional shock or that physical shock, and then it might turn into something that's emotional. And she may say, hey, that physical shock made me feel emotionally unsafe, because I don't want to be uncomfortable physically. I don't want to, that's not funny to me. There are many things about that don't make me feel safe and comfortable. And then she might go into her need and say, I have a need to feel safe and comfortable in our relationship, right? She's owning the feeling, the emotion, and then she's owning what her need is relative to that emotion. Now, before we go any further, I want to go back to the modification that we made. So Rosenberg's methodology is emotion, need, strategy. Now, where we've changed it and we've evolved it, we did that for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think that human beings are inherently wired to be negative. It's a response to our evolution. It's a response to fears that we have. And so, we look for the problems, we look for the negative. And we threw a hypothesis out there one day while we were talking and said, well, what if we just started the day with something that we're proud of, something that we see that was really positive? What if it was, something that happened yesterday that you were really proud of? And what if we had some time to just brag about ourselves? What would that do? And we played with that for a little bit, and it's been a lot of fun. And I can see for myself, I mean, it's changed my perspective significantly. I've started to look at the world in a much more peaceful way, because I'm not looking exterior for positives and then interior for negatives. I'm now seeing the beauty that's everywhere. So that's the one modification that we've made. I mean, Danielle, what's that done for you as we've added the positivity? I think that's only been something that we've done for probably the last, 3 or 4 months.
I think part of it is like the whole like Pavlov theory of, because we've been so repetitive, it's like it's just like conditioned my mind before I even say anything, like I'm already like feeling positive. Like it's just
Yeah.
Just a conditioned response because we've conditioned ourselves. We've Pavloved ourselves into
We
it.
Pavloved ourselves.
We
If our kids listen to that this
They
episode,
would
they'll
know.
love that because there's an inside joke there.
That's
Yeah.
a great T-shirt. I've Pavloved myself. I
I've
like
Pavloved myself. Yeah.
that.
Speaking of
That's
t-shirts,
the
if you're
key
listening to
key
this
to life,
episode and you
key
have
to
not
success.
picked up, yeah, that
Pavlov
is the
yourself.
key. If you're listening to this episode and you haven't picked up one of our Evolve t-shirts on our website, go to evolve-cast.com. We've got all of our merch up there. But think about this Pavlov concept. We have truly Pavloved ourselves, and I'm glad that you said that you start to feel happy and positive as soon as you get into it, because it is that, like, you literally change your emotional state before you even start talking, and I feel the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the other cool thing for me is I love sitting here. Like we typically just, to paint the picture of how we do this. And I'm not saying everybody needs to do it the same way, but we'll do it where either Danielle's on her way to work or I'm on my way to work, whoever has to leave first. And one of us calls the other person and we talk on our way to work. And this is where we do the practice. And what's really cool for me is she'll call me or I'll call her and I'll say, okay, you ready for the practice? Or she'll say, you ready for the practice? And then I always say, okay, ladies go first. And she'll start into the positives. And before she gets going, like, I start to put a smile on my face because now here is the person that I'm connected to the most, the person I love the most, that's now talking about herself positively. And I don't even know how to explain what that does for me inside, but it's kind of like if you have friends and somebody else is talking bad about your friend and you want to defend your friend. Far too often, I think in life, we think that it's okay to talk bad about ourselves, but we forget that we are someone else's favorite person. And so there's been times where Danielle and I have gone back and forth to each other to say, hey, don't talk bad about my best friend. And so this practice of the positive at the beginning, it just puts a huge smile on my face because I love listening to her talk about the things that she's doing really well. And it gives us like kind of this really cool, sometimes maybe 1 or 2 minutes to celebrate with each other and to pat each other on the back. Sometimes it's silly and goofy and we're making fun of each other, joking about the stuff, but it's a cool little celebration that we've added in there.
You know what's interesting?
Right.
What you've done, and I've practiced this a lot. What you've initially done is dislodge yourself from yourselves.
Yeah.
Because,
From the
and
ego,
Steve,
for sure.
you know this phrase that I'm about to say. I use it all the times. It's a phrase I got from meditation, where they say in meditation, what we aim for in meditation is to reduce our near 100% probability of a fixed response to a conditioned stimulus.
Yeah.
And early on, what you guys were talking about is what you do inside of an emotional moment is you allow yourself to pause. And you allow yourself to feel the emotion, whether it's taking a walk. And in that time, it allows you to stop and play with the emotion and almost dislodge yourself from the emotion. And then you can play with it. Because I was thinking what I normally do is if I have an emotion pop up and I'm in that emotional tone and I'm responding to a particular event, person, or situation, I always ask myself, who in the world would respond the opposite of the way I'm responding now?
Yeah, I love that question.
So it's like, and I'll go back to you guys with the shower, the cold water. And I'm playing like I'm Danielle and I've emotionally dislodged myself. I would ask myself, who would respond differently to this? And the person that would respond differently to that is Wim Hof. You know who Wim Hof is, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Oh yeah, the
sure.
cold therapy. Yeah.
The ice
Yeah.
man.
You throw ice on him and he's gonna go make it fucking colder.
Yeah, let's do it. Bring the
Breathe
gloves.
into the cold. The cold is my teacher.
Right. So
I am one with the cold.
When it comes to these emotions, and it's interesting because I get a lot of it. I've grown emotionally because of my ex-wife, because I watch how my ex-wife deals with Tiago. And she deals with Tiago in a way that I think is an amazing, gentle, understanding way. And I would always deal with Tiago in this kind of hard dad way. And the hard dad way wasn't fucking working.
It works until it doesn't.
Right. And I watched how she did it. And I said, okay, if I keep a certain loving foundational dadness, but add these elements that she's using, I could
Sprinkle
come
on
up with some
some.
phenomenal shit here. And it
Yeah,
worked.
Yeah.
It
that's
worked.
great. That's a true artist way of like how else can this be done? How can I look at this from a different angle? I'm only looking at this angle. I need to come on this side now. So
Yeah.
you're getting a 360, and here's the emotion, and you're not attached to it. It's I can look around it from different angles,
Yeah.
can move around. It's here and I'm out here going around it. I'm not in it right here.
And you also gave me another great t-shirt. Thank you. How else can this be done?
Yes.
Oh, I like that. I like that.
Yeah.
Give our listeners that quote again, Miles. I know that you've brought that up before. Say that quote again.
What we aim for in meditation is to reduce our near 100% probability of a fixed response to a conditioned stimulus. And the
I love that.
stimulus, every go ahead.
I'm trying to like get my head around
Everything's
that. I
stimulus.
know.
Everything is
Yeah.
stimulus, right?
Right. Everything is a stimulus. And most people, most of us, usually have one way to respond to a particular stimulus. Like as
Yeah.
Steve said earlier, somebody cuts you off in traffic, you get pissed.
Sure.
That's
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
the
That's a common
stimulus is
common
the
response.
person cutting you off, and your conditioned response is to get upset.
Hmm.
Well, if you change that, all of a sudden, now that you know that you're doing it, it becomes a tool, something that you can manipulate it because most people are not aware. They just respond. They just respond. But the minute you
Hmm.
pause, feel the emotion, you can start to now navigate doing a 180 with
Yep.
that
You own it now.
response. You own it now. I had a moment in a basketball game a long time ago when I was playing college basketball where there was this big brouhaha and people were arguing. It didn't turn into a fight, but it could have. And one of the opposing guys on the bench looked at me, and I was on the court, and he said, "Number 33, why don't you shut the fuck up?" And I looked at him and I said, "Okay, I'm gonna listen to you." And they started laughing when I said that. And I remember
I love
gaining a
that.
That's
great deal of
awesome.
insight from
Okay.
that moment. It was a great insight
Okay.
because it taught me like, I could have been part of this emotional craziness, but I didn't. I flipped it, and they started laughing.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And so
It's
that's what
amazing what we can do.
yeah, that's
Hmm.
the whole idea of um, conditioned responses, conditioned stimuli, all the things that we react automatically to. The minute we stop and just take a breath and go, I can change how I respond to this situation, which
Hmm.
is a great sign of emotional maturity.
Absolutely. That
Yeah.
is emotional maturity. That is it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an iterative process, and for our listeners who haven't listened to episode 63, where we call it Mastering Meditation with Miles, I would highly recommend that you go do that after this episode, because that episode, Miles walks through several meditative practices that you can employ that will help you to understand this, the personal meditative growth that you can go through. One of the things, Miles, that we've found with this practice is it's not just a great way to develop a relationship with each other on a deeper level, but it's actually a great way to develop a better relationship internally with ourselves.
Yeah.
In fact,
Hmm.
the other day, Danielle we were talking about some conflict that she had going on, and she said, "Okay, I've got to think through this." And so I come back after work, and there's a bunch of papers laid out on her desk, and she says, let me show you what I've gone through. And she's written out all of her emotions, thoughts, feelings, and then she's gone through and said, okay, based on this is what my need is, And now here's what my strategy is. These are the things that I'm going to do to accomplish this. Now, because she
Wow.
takes full accountability for it and full accountability for how she feels, what her needs are, and what her strategy is, she's not coming to me and saying, Steve, solve my problem or fix my problem. And the other thing that she's not doing is she's not venting to me. You see, this whole concept of, oh, I need to vent, not that that's a horrible thing, but science has shown that venting is oftentimes ineffective at the desired result. When we vent, especially when we vent anger, it just multiplies and we feel more angry over time. But when you go through this process of saying, here's what my emotion is, you see, you're not leading with emotion. Emotion is there, but you're actually leading with this cognitive process. The Stoics would say that this is the way to live, right? They're telling you to don't ignore your emotion, but also don't let emotion be the horse that drags you through the muck and the mire of your life. So she's got all the emotion. She's taking full accountability for how she feels. She's taking full accountability for what her internal needs are. And then she says, here's my strategy. What do you think? And sometimes we'll do this with each other where I'll say, here's what I think my strategy is. What do you think? And she'll say, well, have you thought about this? Or what about that? And we'll kind of bounce these ideas off of each other so that we can get some social proof on the strategy. Is it going to work? Is it not going to work? We know each other well.
What am I
She
missing?
might look at,
What am I not thinking
yeah,
about?
yeah, what am I missing? What am I not thinking about? Or sometimes it's literally just that we need to be called out on something. Like she'll say, Steve, that's not going to work. Like, I know you, this is what you're not going to do that. You're going to do this other thing. So that's probably a better strategy, and vice versa. We'll call each other out if the strategy is way off. Now,
Mm.
fortunately, that doesn't happen often. And I say fortunately, just because we have iterated through this process to where we know each other, we know ourselves pretty well. But it's also a really good feeling when we get called out for a strategy that is not going to work, because that's the point where we've been living in this self-deception, and that's why as a partner we can help each other to kind of break free from that. So this is a process that once we started to get into this as a couple, I would journal about it. And now I know Danielle does that from time to time. It's not like we're journaling this every day, but when we have conflict inside, we don't just explode at each other. We sometimes will write down, this is what I'm feeling, this is what my needs are, and here's what I think my strategy is. And frankly, for those of you that are listening and are saying, "Well, this sounds great," and you know, I'm going to go try it, and they're painting this beautiful picture. It doesn't mean it's easy, right? It's a simple process, but that doesn't mean it's easy. And I'll tell you that a lot of the time when we put this process together, we'll get to the point where it's strategy. And I'll look at her and I'll say, I don't know what the hell to do. Like, I know how I feel. I know what my need is. And other than my strategy of talking to you right now, I really don't know what the hell to do. And sometimes she'll say, well, have you thought about this? Or have you thought about that? And more often than not, we just look at each other and say, yeah, well, I'm sure you'll figure it out. And we give each other space for the not knowing, because there doesn't always need to be an answer or a strategy right there. And I think
Yeah.
when you talk about this holding space for another person, really that's what it is to us, is we're going to hold space that she feels a way, I feel a way, I have a need, she has a need, and we don't even know what that's going to look like to fix it. But once it's out there in the ether of the universe, we're going to figure that out over time. So Danielle, I want to just run through some questions with you, because I think it's valuable for our listeners um, to hear our perspectives and what's changed. What are some things that have improved? So, how, from your perspective, has our conflict resolution changed?
I think it was really bad. Like I think I've always been kind of more of a touchy feely person, and I would sometimes even get so wrapped up in my emotions that I'd have a hard time identifying them. Like when we first started doing the practice, like I would just struggle just trying to like pinpoint what my actual feelings were. I'm like, what is wrong with me? But so so what's changed is I've gotten good at like knowing I know myself better. And then like if we've gotten into conflict, um, it's real easy now to be like, if we get off track, like if we start getting nitpicky or whatever, it's also like, hold up, stop, this is silly. We know how to do this way better. And it's almost like, often it even just kind of like instantly deflates. It's not even that you always necessarily have to go on a long walk. Sometimes you still do or whatever. It's like, okay, I gotta get like head check. I gotta like rein this in. But I've found often too of just like, like we can even, there's been times where we just kind of like look at each other and it's almost like we start laughing. We've had those moments
Yeah.
where it's like, oh, okay, well, this isn't right. We're not doing this right. This is silly. Then we laugh about it. And then it's like, okay, well, this is how I'm feeling. And then we can do it. So it's, there's definitely been like a ton of progress, but it has taken, at least for me, because I don't think had a lot of I had a lot of emotions. I didn't have a lot of emotional maturity until I like really, like committed to really understand myself more and own it. That like I feel like I've grown a lot in that space that I did as a new person.
Yeah, and it's been really cool to watch. And one thing I do want to point out to our listeners, this is something that recently I was lecturing to a pretty sizable group of executives on communication and conflict resolution. We were actually talking about this topic in particular, and so as I'm lecturing to these executives, the topic of how you process emotions came up. And Danielle and I are two totally different processors. What I mean by that is not just that, like, I'm male, she's female, but Danielle is an external processor. In order for her to understand her emotions, she's got to talk about it. She's got to get it
Yeah.
out there. And along the way, she's going to figure out what that emotion is. And so as we went through this practice, I think, you started you would ramble and you would kind of go through stuff and then you get lost in what you were talking about. And I think one of the things that I've
Hmm.
seen from my perspective is that you've gotten to the point where you're an external processor. And so you process externally by saying, let me think about this. Let me talk it through. And then you get to whatever that emotion or that feeling is pretty quick, but it's still external. Whereas
Hmm.
I'm an internal processor. I think through things and then I speak. Now, the difference between external and internal processors, and here's where, as I was saying to this group the other day, where a lot of conflict can come up, is what an external processor does is they externally process what internal processors do. And so the internal processor sometimes can look at the external processor and say, why are you saying all of those things? And
Hmm.
external processors sometimes
I've
can
heard
feel
that a lot.
embarrassed. Yeah. But seriously, with external processors, they've got to be comfortable with just saying, hey, I'm an external processor, so I'm going to talk this through. It might take me a minute to get to where I'm going to get to, but it's there. Internal processors far too often, and this is where I had to challenge a leader because he said, yeah, but I just think it through. And I said, but if we were to put a recorder inside of your brain, you have all of the same thoughts. You have positive thoughts, you have negative thoughts, you probably got a lot of stupid thoughts that are sitting in there. And just because there's a filter where you process internally, it doesn't mean that you're any different than the external processor. It's just the difference in how you take in that information. And man, when I said this guy's eyes open wide and goes, yeah, I've always thought to myself that if what was in my brain actually came out, people would really wonder who I am. And so internal and external processors have to understand that if you got two external processors, you guys are going to have to rein each other in because this practice could take like 5 hours. If you've got two internal processors, the practice could take 2 minutes, but it should take 10.
Huh.
If you have like we are, where it's an internal external, then it can be a great balance. So there's no right or wrong way, but it's important to understand that all great relationships are built on that triad of trust, honesty, and respect. And so understanding where the other person is and respecting the way they process, it's crucial.
Right.
So I definitely seen that change and that improvement in you, Danielle, that I think has really been cool. What are some other things that have improved, relative to your emotional development and your emotional growth?
Well, that's like personally. Well, then I just think, as the relationship piece, and then just the connection of like just feeling like we're in sync, because I know what you're going through every day. We just have that, like, we know each other better than anyone because we're connected that way. So there's just the relationship piece has its life and legs under it because we've given it life and legs. So there's the personal development, there's the relationship. I know how you're feeling. I already know how you're feeling and how your day's been because we already talked about it. We're connected. So.
Let me ask you guys something. To borrow this term from linguistics, and I'll tell a brief story, and then let you guys both chime in with your marriage if this resonates. I was arguing with a friend of mine. It was a basketball argument, and he was arguing the way it is, and I was arguing the way it should be, but I didn't know it at the time, and it created a tremendous amount of conflict. And then it dawned on me that we were not having an argument at all because we were both defending two different positions.
Yeah.
He was describing what is actually happening, and I was looking at it from an idealistic point of view of what should and could happen. And in linguistics, they call it prescriptive and descriptive language. Describers describe what events are taking place. Prescribers say this is what should happen, and it's mostly used in language. But I notice a lot of people have these kinds of debates, and they're totally unaware that they're arguing two different things, which nullifies the fact that it's not an argument. They're just not seeing their perspective. They're each respectively their perspective. Could you guys recognize anything like that?
Yeah.
Because it would seem like Steve would be a prescriber and Danielle would be a describer.
What do you think,
Does
Danielle?
that resonate at all?
Yeah, I guess it's if you're taking the time to understand the other person of what they're trying to say. Like, have you asked, are you out of your own head and are you trying to get in their head? Have you asked questions like, are you there just to give your perspective, or are you really like, where are they coming from? Why are they saying this? So where's
that's been part of our practice is the questioning. And I think that's an important thing rather than defending where you're at, just asking the question. So I want to make sure I understand you right. Is this what you're saying?
Right.
The other thing too, that we've gotten to the point where I actually think if somebody were to kind of see us communicate from time to time and they didn't know us, we're very direct about certain things. So there might be times where Danielle's saying something or I'm saying something, and one of us is not really hearing the essence of what they're saying. And so she'll look at me or I'll look at her and say, no, you're not understanding what I'm saying.
Missing the boat.
Yeah, or you're missing the boat. And it's very direct, right? It's not mean, but it's direct. And that, again, when we talk about this common lexicon, this common language, like we talked about with cold water, if we look at each other and say, no, you're not hearing me. See, when we say you're not hearing me, what we mean is you're not hearing my emotion. You're not hearing the intent. You're not hearing what's going behind, this.
It's being filtered because it's like Steve might bring something to me and then I'm thinking that he's meaning this. And then I'm like, acting off, like just what you said. It's like, I interpreted it to mean this. And then it's like, no, that you're missing the whole point. Like that's you're missing the context of like what the real point is. And it's like, okay, back up. What do you mean by that? Like where, it's like, okay, I got to ask some questions because my head went here, my filters took me here, and I'm not seeing the right perspective. And so it's like time to ask questions.
And if he's filtering his response, if he's filtering himself, you're not getting a complete picture of what he's trying to say.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like we talked about, I mean, the skill set. So when you think about this skill set that you have to develop, it's a two-pronged skill set. It's the ability to understand your emotions, needs, and your strategy, and being able to communicate that in words that the other person is going to understand.
Right. Yeah.
But on
Yeah.
the other end, it's about understanding when somebody communicates to you their emotion, their needs, and their strategy. You have to be able to hear that. And
Mm-hmm.
here we talk about from the heart, right? So you have to understand, like Danielle was talking about, the context, the intent. But then sometimes when we say, no, you're not listening, then there might be some details that are being missed in there.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
hear is heart, listen is ears, and those are the common language terms that we use, but it's a two-pronged approach. You have to be able to communicate without a filter externally, and then you have to be able to take it in, and those two skills are paramount to success. At any time in this cycle of communication, you can see some sort of breakdown in there. So I think that the listening and the practice itself gets rid of a lot of that, because we don't really, if we're interrupting or we're interjecting when the other person is doing their practice, more often than not, it's just to nod and to say, oh yeah, that sucks, I'm sorry. Or, it's something that's supportive. Or if it's celebratory, hey, I feel happy and I'm excited. Yeah, that's really cool, right? We're supporting, we're empathizing with what the other person is saying. Very rarely is there any interjection while the other person is talking about their emotion or their feelings. So I think oftentimes, Miles, like you talked about with these two different ways of communicating, um, you get rid of that with this practice, because you're talking about the emotion, the need, and the strategy. And
Mm-hmm.
when you get into that rhythm and that cadence, the skills just develop, and you kind of fly by that that ability that you have to create that chasm.
Yeah.
So Danielle, I want to. We talked a little bit about how this changed you personally. Um, I want to ask you, as we've done this practice, what are the changes you've seen in me?
Thank you for listening to the Evolve Podcast. If you like this episode, share it with your friends. Follow us on Instagram at evolve_cast and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcasting app. And now it's time for you to get out there and evolve.